The woods can be a really peaceful place to visit, but they can also be terrifying. From strange lights and whispers in the dark to blood-curdling screams, some encounters defy explanation. We're diving into real-life stories of people who have experienced the unexplainable deep in the wilderness. Was it paranoia, or something much more sinister? In this episode, we have 5 stories featuring terrifying encounters in the woods. The last story in particular is truly spine-chilling, so make sure you stick around for that one. Now, let's get into the stories. When I was a kid, my family lived in a neighbourhood that bordered a large wooded area. The trees were tall, the foliage thick, and the winding trails connected the backyards of all the houses. It was the perfect place for an adventure. I spent countless hours there with the other kids from the neighbourhood, swinging on vines, climbing trees, and just letting our imaginations run wild. One of my closest childhood friends was a kid called Jason. Our mums had been really good friends for years, so we practically grew up together. We played with everything together, from Lego to Hot Wheels, and action figures to slot cars. We also spent a lot of time outside together, riding our bikes, running through the woods, and pretending we were superheroes. Those woods were our playground. When I was about 7 years old, my family moved away from the area, but every now and then we'd visit again to see old friends. So, every few years, I'd see Jason again, and sometimes we'd even drive by our old house. The woods that had once seemed endless now looked much smaller, though the memories of playing there remained vivid. Out of nowhere, he asked, "Do you remember when we saw that clown in the woods behind your old house?" I stared at him, completely thrown off. What? A clown in the woods? He nodded, yeah. We were running through the trees, just the two of us, and we came around a bend in the path. The clown was standing there, just staring at us, and we freaked out and ran straight back to your house. I had absolutely no memory of this. If I'd encountered something that terrifying as a kid, surely I'd have remembered it, right? Jason, on the other hand, was completely convinced. He was absolutely terrified of clowns, always had been, so maybe his imagination had just exaggerated something. I dismissed it as a childhood misunderstanding, something that had stuck with him more than it had stuck with me, and we moved on. Yet, his words really lingered in my mind. A few years later, we visited again, and once more, Jason mentioned the clown incident. "Are you sure you don't remember that clown in the woods?" he asked, his tone just as serious as before. I sighed. "Dude, I remember you asking me about this before, and I still don't remember it happening. Are you sure you didn't mix it up with a dream or something?" He shook his head. "I swear it happened. We both froze when we saw it. I even remember looking over at you, and you were just as terrified as I was. We both ran like crazy back to your house." This time, something flickered in my mind. A vague, hazy image of something hanging in a tree. Not a real clown though. More like one of those inflatable punching bag clowns, half deflated, hanging from a branch. I told Jason this, insisting that if anything, that was what we saw. But he absolutely refused to believe that this was anything but a real person standing there staring at us. Years passed by, and the next time I saw Jason, we were adults, in our mid-20s. Yet, once again, he brought it up. I didn't argue anymore. I just laughed and said, "It's funny, I still don't remember it happening, but the more you bring it up, the more I think maybe it could have been real." Even now, at 40 years old, I still think about that conversation from time to time. Did we actually see something in the woods that day? Is my brain just filling in the gaps because I've heard the story so many times? Or was it just a trick of childhood imagination? I've never asked Jason about it again, but part of me wonders, if I did, would he still remember the experience as vividly as he did before? Has anyone else ever experienced anything like this, where you don't remember an event, but somebody else swears that it happened, until eventually it starts to feel real? Let me know in the comments. This happened years ago, but I still think about it often. No matter how much time passes, I still can't explain what I experienced that night. For reference, I live in the southwest of the UK. When I was around 17 years old, so about 15 years ago, I had a really bad argument with my mum and she kicked me out. With nowhere to go, I spent the night wandering the streets, trying to stay awake. I asked a few friends if I could crash at their place, but for one reason or another, this wasn't an option. At the time, I lived in a fairly new suburban area, but just beyond it was a large stretch of woodland overlooking farmland. At around 2 AM, I decided to head over there to maybe find a quiet spot to rest and watch the stars for a while. Near a block of flats, I found a way through a thick patch of bushes that led to a small clearing. It was absolutely pitch black, but it seemed like a safe place to settle down. However, as I lay there trying to relax, I suddenly heard some footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, and were pacing around me in a circle. At this point, my heart was racing. I called out to see if anyone was there, but there was no response. Instead, the footsteps grew faster, moving erratically all around me. And then I heard it. A deep, guttural growl. Whatever it was, it sounded big, and panic set in. I bolted, crashing back through the thicket and onto the nearest street. At this point, I was totally exhausted, scared, and desperate for a place to stay. I had about £100 left in my bank account, so I walked to a nearby hotel hoping to stay there for the night, but they wouldn't let me in. Cold and on edge, I walked to a nearby 24-hour store where I bought some snacks and a flashlight, or torch if you're in the UK. I didn't know what else to do, so I decided to head back to the woods, this time armed with my light. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I hadn't. Either way, I wanted answers. Literally, the second I stepped back into that clearing, those footsteps started again. This time, I was ready. I switched on the torch and swung it around in every direction. The bushes, the trees, the ground. But there was nothing there. No movement. No sign of anything or anyone. Then, the growl came again. Deep, low, and way too close. It felt like it was actually right next to me, but no matter where I shined that torch, there was nothing there. I could hear this thing, but I couldn't see it. That was more than enough for me. I turned and ran until I reached the bus stop, where I spent the rest of the night, too scared to sleep. The next day, I met up with one of my friends and told her everything. I needed to know if I'd imagined it, or if something truly strange had happened. Of course, she was hesitant, but I managed to convince her to come back with me. When we arrived, she refused to go past the thicket, so I went in alone. And then again, I heard it. The same guttural growl. Low, deep, and way too close. It was impossible to ignore, and this time, it was in broad daylight. I still couldn't see what on earth was making that sound. Nothing moved. Nothing was there, but I could still hear it. My friend must have heard something too, because she yelled for me to get out of there, and I wasn't about to argue. I know how this sounds, and if somebody else told me this story, I probably wouldn't believe them either. But I know what I heard. It terrifies me still to this day, and I can't explain it. If anyone has experienced something similar, I'd love to hear about it. If you're enjoying this episode so far, please do me a massive favour by clicking on the like button and subscribing to the channel. Now, on to the next story. I want to start off by saying I've always been pretty sceptical when it comes to the paranormal and cryptids and things like that. I've spent my whole life in the outdoors and I've had my fair share of strange experiences, but I usually manage to find a logical explanation. That being said, something happened recently that I'm really struggling to get my head around. This all took place over the course of 2 weeks in the mountains of western Montana. It all started one night when I was at a secluded campfire spot with one of my friends. As we were sitting there, we noticed some strange lights in the distance. At first, we figured it was just a late night hiker with a headlamp, but considering how secluded we were, this just didn't sit right with us. The way the light was moving just felt a little off. We didn't stick around for long and decided to head back. A few days later, I went back to the same area, this time alone. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but after about an hour, I saw the light again. Only this time, there was 3 of them. The strange part, all 3 of the lights moved in perfect sync, bobbing up and down as if they were connected to the same source. Thinking they might be a reflection of a sign or something I'd never noticed before, I decided to start walking towards them. But as I approached, they seemed to retreat, always keeping approximately 300 yards between us. That was enough for me. I turned around and left. A few days after that, I returned once more, this time at around 2:30 am, and instantly I got a feeling of unease, as if I was being watched. Then at around 3:45 am, I heard a whistle from deep in the woods. It was just one single note, far off in the distance, so I brushed it off as a bird or something. However, around 20 minutes later, I heard the whistling again, but this time it was a tune. It lasted for a solid 15 seconds and couldn't have been any further than 50 yards away from me. That was enough. Once again, I darted straight out of there, got back into my car and drove away, and I've never been back since. Maybe I'm just letting my imagination get the best of me, especially since the camper was murdered in the area not long ago. I just can't shake how unnatural those lights felt, and that whistling was way too eerie and intentional to have been some kind of animal. Has anyone experienced anything similar, or have any idea what it might have been? For reference, here's a photo I took of what I saw on the second night. This morning, me and my best friend decided to take our kids and dogs for a walk in a forest area in Gloucestershire in the UK. For reference, we're both female, she's 34 and I'm 33. It's a place we've been to many times before, but the very moment we arrived, something just felt off. The air felt heavy, and the atmosphere was unsettling to say the least. The dogs seemed nervous too. Mine in particular kept whining and barking, which is very unlike her. My 4-year-old daughter refused to leave my side, while my friend's 7-year-old twins, always full of energy, decided to run up ahead. The woods have 2 main trails, a high path and a lower one, with a deep valley running beneath them both. As we walked along the lower path, the twins decided to climb the steep slope up to the higher path, something they'd done many times before. My friend's dog followed them up, and when they reached the top, they were screaming and yelling that they could hear pigs in the distance, which isn't uncommon around there. And then, in an instant, they were gone. We frantically called their names, expecting them to answer or reappear at any moment, but there was only silence. This was completely out of character of both of the boys. They never run out of sight like this. My friend panicked and tried her hardest to climb the slope, but it was just too steep. Then, from the valley below us, we heard it. An ear-piercing, agonised scream. It sounded a bit like a dog in pain, as if it had been caught in a snare. My friend immediately assumed it was her dog and stopped trying to climb the slope, calling frantically to him. The screaming just intensified, a desperate, gut-wrenching sound. She was about to climb down into the valley to help, when I caught some movement in the corner of my eye. Her dog was walking towards us from the direction the twins had vanished, and just like that, the horrible screaming stopped. And then, out of nowhere, a woman appeared from the top of the slope. She called down to us, saying the twins were walking back along the path towards the start of the woods. My friend shouted thank you, and relieved, started running back to meet the boys. But, as we both turned back to where the woman was standing, she was gone, completely vanished. There was absolutely no sign of her anywhere. But before we could even process that, a massive herd of deer, at least 50, suddenly charged past us from the exact spot where that woman had just been standing, running down into the valley where we just heard those screams. It was a surreal, almost unnatural sight. My friend took off down the path to find her kids, leaving me and my daughter behind. As I walked quickly towards the start of the woods, I heard some movement beside me. It was more deer in the valley, this time a smaller group of 5, following the others. I picked up my daughter so she could see them, but as I put her back down again, a strange noise cut through the air. It was close, and it sounded like a rotary phone ringing. I stopped for a second, taking a moment to scan the trees, but there was nothing. The second I looked away, the noise started again. It was deliberate. As soon as I looked back, it stopped. Both dogs were on high alert, pulling at their leads, ears flicking back towards whatever was behind us. I suddenly had an overwhelming, instinctual certainty. Me and my daughter were no longer safe. Something, or someone, was trying to separate us all. I ignored the sound, kept my daughter close, and hurried forward, practically dragging the dogs along with me. As we rounded the bend, I saw my friend, and she had the twins with her, and they both looked pale and terrified. They told us that while they were up on the path, they both started screaming because they could hear twigs snapping and leaves rustling all around them, as if something was moving towards them. Then, they saw a woman. They said she had a familiar face, as if they knew her, but something was off. They described her skin as looking too shiny, and she told them to walk back down the path. Here's the thing though, we would definitely recognise any woman from the school, and we didn't recognise that woman at all. Even stranger, the twins swear they could hear us calling to them, and they were shouting back to us, but we couldn't hear them. We both felt a really strong sense that something in that woods was trying to pull us apart. We've been researching similar experiences, and the only thing that we can find is something called panic in the woods. A phenomenon where people report unexplained fear, disorientation, and confusion in forested areas. But what we both experience feels like something way more sinister than just panic. Neither of us can explain what happened. Has anyone else ever encountered anything like this? Any thoughts or theories would be much appreciated. For context, I live in Virginia on an old plantation, and there's a cemetery just up the road. My sister is really spiritual and has connections with local psychics. Personally, I've never been one to believe in that kind of thing, but one night, she got a call from one of her friends saying don't go outside at night. The deer aren't really deer. This alone was really unsettling, but weird things have happened around here before. We found circles of bones in the woods from some sort of cult, and my sister and one of her friends have been chased out there. If you're outside at night, Sometimes it sounds like there's more footsteps than there should be, as if something you can't see is walking right next to you. I've always chalked it up to paranoia, but other people say they've noticed it too. I've always been the type to look for a logical explanation, never just jump to a paranormal conclusion. But after what happened last night, I just don't know what to think anymore. It was around 3 AM. I know, the devil's hour. But honestly, that's when it happened. I was outside by this old burnt up shed by my house, just having a smoke and listening to music. When I finished, I turned off my music, stood up to stretch and put my jacket back on, getting ready to go back inside. And that's when I heard it. A scream. But this wasn't just any scream. This was inhuman. Honestly, it sounded like something straight out of a horror movie. I have heard foxes and owls before. This was nothing like that. It was loud. It was shrill. And it seemed to be coming from the woods nearby. Trees rustled, and whatever was making that sound just kept on screaming, as if it was being attacked, or it was distressed or something. My initial instinct was to think that it was some kind of animal. Maybe a bear. But bears don't scream like that. I was frozen in place, almost too scared to stand. I knew I needed to get back to the house, but it wasn't exactly close, and I didn't want to be out there unarmed. I waited for that noise to stop, hoping that whatever it was would just leave. What? The very second I even shifted my leg without making a sound, the screaming started again, and then whatever it was bolted straight into the woods, still screaming. I could hear it getting further and further away, the sound gradually fading into the distance. Then, almost immediately, the dogs from down the road started barking like crazy. That was enough for me. I ran into the shed and grabbed the closest thing I could as a weapon, which just happened to be a plank of wood. I grabbed my jacket and my phone and ran as fast as I could back to the house. Nothing happened after that, but as soon as my sister walked through the front door, I was shaking and crying uncontrollably. I still have absolutely no idea what that thing was, but it terrified me like nothing ever has. If anyone knows what I can do to protect myself, or if you have any idea what that could have been, please let me know. And if you think it was just an animal, let me know which one. I'll tell you if it sounded anything like that. That's all for today. I really hope you enjoyed those stories. For more terrifying stories just like this, click here. As always, thanks for watching. I'm your host, Severed Soul.